Hi, welcome to Startup Island, a podcast about founders and the choices they make. I'm Douglas Kretz, Communications Master for AppWorks Accelerator. This show is dedicated to helping early-stage founders calibrate their decision-making and intuition by examining the startup choices that founders make on their startup journey. If you are a founder building a startup in AI or in blockchain, we invite you to follow our channel and visit our website at appworks.tw, where you will find information about joining our twice-yearly accelerator, a free program that takes no equity from founders and introduces them to one of the most vibrant digital economies in Greater Southeast Asia, Taiwan. In this episode, we meet Andrew Jiang, co-founder of Soda Labs. Andrew used to consider himself a Silicon Valley entrepreneur in the very early days of Soda Labs. He and some members of his team had emerged as founders in an environment shaped by VC money and tech companies that had enjoyed huge success. In this roughly 10-minute interview, AppWorks analyst June talks to Andrew about his decision to come to Taiwan and what at first seemed like a risky move to trade an abundance of capital for a search for talent.
All right, Andrew, thank you for joining us today. So for those of our viewers that might not be familiar with Soda Labs, your company, can you first introduce what is it exactly you guys do?
Sure. So Soda Labs, we are a hardware as a service venture builder. What that means is that we take hardware from large OEMs, we partner with Foxconn in Taiwan, and turn it into recurring revenue services where we put it into retail stores, offices, that kind of stuff.
Okay, and now I believe you have a pretty substantial R&D base in Taiwan at the moment, but originally the bulk of your team was actually from Silicon Valley. What prompted you guys to initially come to Taiwan and start shop here?
Yeah, actually the initial reason why we came was one of our biggest partners and biggest investors, Foxconn, is here in Taipei, or in China. And honestly, between being in China and being Taipei is a lot better of a place to live and work. But the other thing that really brought us here was the talent, right? We knew a lot of people in Taiwan that kind of straddled this hardware, software, embedded software in between, and knew a lot of talent was here, and also talked to a number of people to know that in terms of the hiring pool and the cost of talent, Taiwan was very competitive.
Mm-hmm. But in order to build up a meaningful hardware and engineering team, Andrew decided to make the move to Taiwan. And here, the move was a positive one, but it was slightly different than Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the message that we like to tell teams outside of Taiwan, that Taiwan does have a pretty strong talent pool. It's also quite affordable. So those are the initial impressions. But now that you've been here for quite a few months already, set up the operations, how have the realities matched up with the expectations?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we originally got set up in October and started hiring. I think as of today, I think we have like 4 or 5 local Taiwanese people, but we've been recruiting pretty much the entire time. One of the things that I think that we and a lot of startups that are in our position have a challenge with is pipeline. It's how do you find good talent here that's both in the mindset to do work for a startup and is willing to come to you, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we realized is that a lot of the talent that's here doesn't necessarily actively look. And it's very different from the US. And especially in Silicon Valley, most people, even if they're in a happy job, are sort of actively thinking about, what's the next big company I can join? How do I advance myself in my career? Yeah. I think just culturally, a lot of people here tend to be a bit more conservative, right? A little bit more grounded in safety. If they're going to move, they want to know that the opportunity is good, and they're not going to be actively looking on job sites. So job sites have not been very good for us. Okay. The people that we found through job sites, again, either tend to be in unique situations, or maybe just aren't, again, the type of people that we're looking for.
For those who don't know, Taiwan graduates 25,000 engineers or more each year from its universities. Many startup founders from the region and internationally hire these engineers because of factors like lower labor costs, buoyed by the fact that most of these engineers are bilingual and well-versed in innovation practice.
We've had a lot more success through talking at events, hosting events, through a very aggressive, proactive direct outreach. And that's allowed us to build much more of a pipeline. That being said, once people are in our pipeline, our rate of closing and getting people to sign on is a lot higher than it would be in the US, simply because your competitive pool is a lot smaller, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it stands to reason that if it's hard to get people in the pipeline, once you actually get in there, they're not talking to like a bunch of companies.
Yeah.
Usually they're just talking to you, and maybe they're talking to another company, but it's still a lot easier once you're in the pipeline to close someone.
Right. Okay. So job sites haven't really worked that much, and events has obviously been one channel you've worked through. Are there any other channels that you tried to explore, for example, like headhunters?
We've tried headhunters. I'd love to say that we had success with headhunters. We don't really. Friends have been helpful. Network has been helpful. I'm trying to think. We hired someone who was working at AppWorks as an English tutor, which is fantastic. To be perfectly honest, I think, especially within a place like Taiwan, and for a company that has no brand here, like no one knows who we are, just outside of maybe some people at AppWorks. It does take a lot of proactive outreach, but also just like kind of sharing our company, right? And I think a lot of the people in Taiwan really have a strong sense of intellectual curiosity. They want to learn, right? And part of the reason why we hold events, we give talks, but it also means that we have to kind of push ourselves out there as a place where you can go to work to advance your career, advance your own abilities as an engineer, as a designer, and whatnot, right?
So it turns out local knowledge and local experience are more important than a general mainstream narrative of what startups are all about, especially when it comes to talent and hiring. Silicon Valley has reached such a mythical status that founders make a lot of assumptions about what all tech culture and all startup building is like based on that experience. This is natural. We all use commonly shared stories or myths to build our framework of understanding. Startup operations are different. As the discussion with Andrew shows, a founder can end up making decisions at first based on what he assumes running any startup is like. But that assumption, or those assumptions, may not be entirely correct. In fact, your startup is your startup. It's your experience. It's based entirely on the empirical evidence that you gather engaging with your team and your customers. Being able to see this truth is absolutely critical to long-term success.
Right? So internally what we're doing things like hosting events, but we're also creating recruiting videos and creating more content to kind of market ourselves. I think that's just a needed part no matter where you are in the world, but I think in Taiwan, in Taipei especially, it's going to make a big difference in building people in our pipeline.
Okay, so now that you actually have them in your company, you've established a team. I mean, Andrew, you've had substantial experience working with engineers both in Vietnam as well as Silicon Valley, the US. Have you needed to change the way you go about managing team here in Taiwan in terms of motivating them and keeping them incentivized?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think anyone, a lot of the companies that go through AppWorks tend to be Southeast Asian companies, and the mindset around what it means to be part of a startup and things like equity is very different from Silicon Valley. Honestly, as a founder, I value my equity, and for a lot of early stage employees at startups in Silicon Valley, equity is a big part of compensation, right? And so as we're here and as we started, we wanted to be incredibly generous with equity, right? These are people that are helping us build companies from the ground up. We want to share in success with them as they've kind of shared in that risk with us. We realized, both in Vietnam and here, is that people have a very different mindset towards equity. And I think part of that is just, it's not having enough experience with what equity could mean, right? Okay. And not really assigning that much value. It's kind of this very in concept, this nice idea, but no one here knows anyone as an early stage employee at a startup that's gotten rich off of that, right? So a lot of that is understanding that mindset and knowing that at the base level, you have to pay fairly competitively, right? It might mean that, and I know a couple startups here that just don't give away a lot of equity. Personally, the way that we've kind of dealt with it is, I think, trying to share how we value equity and looking for ways that we can assign real value to equity. And so we're thinking about things like stock buyback programs and the like, because we want everyone that joins us to be incentivized not just by salary, but by this long-term mechanism that I think hopefully in their mindset is closer to profit sharing, where their success is aligned with the success of the company. I think that's really hard to do, but honestly, as more tech startups see success in Southeast Asia, that'll change.
Yeah, that's true. So you think this whole notion of employees not generally placing as much of an emphasis on value as equity as, say, those in the States, is that more of the nature of the stage of this ecosystem, or is it that more of a cultural context?
Absolutely, it's stage of ecosystem, because if you look at China, equity means a lot more now, right? And not just because like a few companies, like the Alibaba gang made their money and everyone's like, oh, well, this is like a viable path. Now, one generation afterwards, everyone wants to be an entrepreneur and everyone's willing to work insanely hard to make that happen, right? You show signs of success and people know that this is a viable path. But before that, it's very hard, right? It's the same way that once Groupon showed that they could get some traction going by the group buying route, there's hundreds of Groupon clones. Someone leads the way, everyone else kind of follows, right? And I think, to be honest, not that I know all that much about the history of startups in Taiwan, there just hasn't been enough of that.
Okay.
Right? And the other aspect is that for the people that do understand that and are willing to take the risk, a lot of them are going to Singapore, China, and these other places where, again, this mindset is probably more prevalent. We'd love to figure out how to build that here.
Sure. Right? Yeah, okay. Well, Andrew, I want to thank you for joining us today. For those people that want to follow up with Soda Labs and learn a little bit more about what you guys do, where can they find you?
They can find us at sodalabs.co, because we're too cheap to pay for the .com. sodalabs.co.
And you're also on LinkedIn as well, right?
We're on LinkedIn
Andrew?
as well. Yeah.
All right, you can find Andrew on LinkedIn as well. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The experience shared by this founder in this podcast is, of course, unique, but it's not an isolated experience. Being a founder doesn't happen in a vacuum. In running AppWorks for about 10 years, we've observed so many startups making the move to Taiwan and utilizing the best practices they learn here by interacting with other founders, by interacting with mentors, by tapping into the rich engineering talent that's here. For example, Shopback, a regional e-commerce rebates platform, was founded in Singapore, but the two founders, Henry Chan and Joel Long, actually moved up to Taiwan to take part in our accelerator. After graduating, they established an office here and told us that had they known about the Taiwan e-commerce economy earlier, they would have been here sooner and used that experience and knowledge to shape their regional expansion. M17, started by a Singaporean named Joseph Hua. He actually grew his company out of his acquisition of a local Taiwanese company called 17 Media. A few years later, Joseph's aggressive acquisition of engineering talent and his decision to base in Taipei have helped him grow M17's market share of live streaming in developed Asia to over 60%. Our accelerator is primarily open to AI and blockchain founders. If you would like to give it a try in Taiwan, you should know that we do not take equity, and the entire program is free. We will continue doing a series of these podcasts. We thank you for listening, and if you'd like to leave some comments in the post or share with us something on IG, Facebook, or on our blog, please drop us a line. Good day or good night, wherever you are, and thank you for being a founder.